The grand hall shimmered with crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over the gathered guests, their chatter a low hum beneath the strains of a string quartet. Marcus Sterling stood near the entrance, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a physical force. The day that was meant to be the culmination of his meticulously crafted life had become an impossible crossroads. He adjusted his tie, the silk feeling more like a noose than an accessory. Every detail was perfect, the floral arrangements, the lighting, the guest list curated for maximum social advantage. Yet he felt nothing but a profound emptiness. This wedding wasn't about love. It was a corporate merger disguised in white lace. Charlotte represented the final piece of his family's empire, a strategic alliance that would solidify his control. But the ghost of Eleanor haunted this ceremony, her absence a louder presence than any vow he would speak today. He had built this gilded cage with his own hands, and now he was expected to live in it. The officiant's voice cut through his thoughts, the final question hanging in the air between them. "Marcus Sterling, do you take Charlotte to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The words echoed in the cavernous space, demanding an answer he wasn't sure he could give. Charlotte's smile was fragile, a triumph she believed was already hers. Her eyes held the cold calculation of a business deal closing, not the warmth of a lifelong commitment. He opened his mouth, the mechanical response forming on his lips, a hollow "I do," ready to seal his fate. He was going through the motions, his mind 1,000 miles away from this opulent prison. It was at that precise moment, as the single syllable began to leave his throat, that the massive oak doors at the back of the chapel burst open. The sound was explosive, a crack of wood against stone that silenced the quartet mid-note. Every head turned in unison. The stunned silence that followed was heavier than any music, thick with shock and anticipation. Standing in the doorway, backlit by the afternoon sun, was a figure he never expected to see again. Eleanor. She wasn't broken or pleading as he might have imagined. She stood fiercely determined, her simple dignity a stark contrast to the opulent backdrop. And she wasn't alone. She pushed a triple stroller into the aisle, her hands steady and sure. The 3 children inside had his unmistakable eyes. Before anyone could speak, her voice rang out, clear and absolute, shattering the ceremony into a million pieces. "The wedding is off. What would you do if your past walked in at the worst possible moment? Comment shocked if you didn't see that coming. Subscribe for more dramatic twists." The declaration hung in the air, a truth bomb that vaporized the carefully constructed reality of the ceremony. Eleanor didn't move from the aisle, her gaze fixed on Marcus with an intensity that bypassed his shock and went straight to his soul. She was thinner than he remembered, her face etched with a resilience that hadn't been there 5 years ago. The simple, elegant dress she wore was a quiet rebellion against the extravagant couture surrounding her. She wasn't here to beg. She was here to collect a debt he didn't even know he owed. All eyes dropped to the stroller, a sleek, modern contraption that held the real evidence. 3 pairs of eyes, wide with curiosity at the sudden silence and the sea of staring faces, looked out. A boy with a head of dark, unruly curls, a girl clutching a worn stuffed rabbit, and another boy peeking shyly from behind his brother. And every single one of them had the sterling eyes, the same sharp, crystalline blue that had stared back at Marcus from the mirror his entire life. The resemblance wasn't just striking, it was undeniable. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the chapel, a wave of shock that broke the silence. Whispers began, frantic and hushed. Cameras, phones, previously reserved for the happy couple, were now surreptitiously raised, capturing the unimaginable scandal unfolding in real time. Eleanor's posture never wavered. She had delivered her line, and now she let the devastating truth of her arrival, and the 3 living proofs she brought with her, sink into the collective consciousness of the room. She had shattered his perfect day, not with a scream, but with a quiet, unassailable fact. Would you stay to face the truth or run from it? Let me know your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe for the next part of this unforgettable story. Charlotte's initial shock was a physical thing, a tremor that started in her perfectly manicured hands and traveled up her arms until her entire body seemed to vibrate with disbelief. Her triumphant smile had vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice a strained thread of sound. "What is this? Who is this woman?" The word woman was spat out like an insult. But Marcus was already in motion, his mind shifting from stunned paralysis to cold, corporate damage control. This was a breach, a problem to be managed. He took a half-step forward, his face a carefully constructed mask of anger and denial. "Eleanor," he said, his voice cold and cutting, a tone he used to dismiss underperforming executives. "This is neither the time nor the place for your theatrics. You will leave. Now." He gestured subtly toward the security personnel stationed near the doors, who began to move cautiously down the aisle. The guests' murmurs transformed into audible gasps at his icy response. This was not the reaction of a man confronted with a shocking lie, but of a man scrambling to contain a catastrophic truth. Eleanor didn't flinch. Her gaze remained locked on him, unwavering and devastatingly calm. She ignored Charlotte completely, her focus absolute. "Theatrics," she repeated, her voice still clear, carrying to the very back of the chapel. "These are your children, Marcus. There's no drama here, only a fact you've avoided for 5 years." The little girl in the stroller, sensing the rising tension, began to whimper softly, clutching her rabbit tighter. It was this small, human sound that cut through the mounting confrontation. Then, the boy with the dark curls, the boldest of the three, leaned forward. He looked directly at Marcus, his small brow furrowed in confusion. "Are you our daddy?" he asked, his voice high and innocent, yet it landed in the silence with the force of a physical blow. "Mama has pictures. She said you were busy." The question, so simple and devastatingly honest, shattered Marcus's cold facade. The air left his lungs. He stared at the child, really seeing him for the first time. The shape of his nose, the curve of his jaw, a miniature version of his own childhood portraits. The denial he'd been preparing died on his tongue. The security guards froze, uncertain. Charlotte made a small, choked sound, her hand flying to her throat as the fragile illusion of her future disintegrated in the face of that innocent, undeniable truth. The first fracture in Marcus Sterling's empire had appeared, and it was only 3 feet tall. The truth is out. Who do you think is telling the real story? Marcus or Eleanor? Type Team Eleanor or Team Marcus in the comments. The drama is just getting started, so hit subscribe for what happens next. The boy's question, "Are you our daddy?" didn't just hang in the air. It tore a hole in the present, pulling Marcus back 5 years into a past he had meticulously buried. The cold, opulent chapel dissolved, replaced by the warm, chaotic energy of his restaurant's kitchen. That was where he had first truly seen Eleanor, not as staff, but as a person. She was a sous chef, her hands a blur of precise motion, her laughter a bright counterpoint to the sizzle and steam. He was the arrogant heir, slumming it to understand the business from the ground up. She was the talent, the heart of the operation he only saw as a balance sheet. Their affair had been a secret fire, burning in stolen moments after late shifts. It was passionate, real, and utterly terrifying to a man like Marcus, whose life was a series of calculated moves. With Eleanor, there were no calculations. There was only the dizzying, dangerous feeling of being truly known. He remembered the scent of her perfume mixed with thyme and roasting garlic, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the feeling of her hand in his. A connection that felt more substantial than any corporate merger. But the Sterling family, led by his formidable mother, had taken notice. Eleanor, with her unsuitable background and lack of pedigree, was a threat to the dynasty. Whispers began, carefully manufactured scandals suggesting she was a gold digger, that she was leveraging their relationship for career advancement. The pressure mounted, subtle at first, then brutally direct. His mother had sat him down in her study, the portrait of his stern-faced grandfather looking on. "This infatuation will ruin you, Marcus. It will ruin everything we've built. She is not one of us." He had fought, weakly, but the weight of generations of expectation was a crushing force. Then came the night everything broke. A high-profile client complained of a hair in their dish, a dish Eleanor had prepared. The evidence was flimsy, the accusation theatrical. But Marcus, exhausted from the family pressure and his own cowardice, saw a way out. He didn't investigate. He didn't defend her. In front of the entire kitchen staff, his voice cold and foreign to his own ears, he'd fired her. He cited unacceptable standards and breach of trust. The look on her face wasn't just anger. It was a profound, devastating betrayal. She had said nothing. She simply took off her apron, placed it on the stainless steel counter, and walked out. He never saw her again. He heard she'd left the city. He'd told himself it was for the best. He'd shut down that part of himself, the part that felt anything, and built higher walls. The ghost of what had been locked away, until this moment, when she walked back in, not as a memory, but as a reckoning, with 3 living reminders of the life he'd chosen to destroy. Do you think Marcus can ever be redeemed after what he did? Share yes or a no in the comments. The confrontation is about to get even more intense, so subscribe so you don't miss a second. Charlotte's world, a meticulously constructed edifice of social climbing and financial security, collapsed in the space of a single, innocent question. The tremor in her hands became a full-body shudder as the boy's words, "Are you our daddy?" echoed in the stunned silence. Her gaze darted from Marcus's ashen, frozen face to the 3 children who were living, breathing proof of a life he'd hidden. This wasn't a disruption. It was an annihilation. The prenuptial agreement, the merger of fortunes, the title of Mrs. Marcus Sterling. All of it was evaporating before the eyes of the very society she had worked a lifetime to conquer. Her panic turned venomous. A desperate animal backed into a corner. She took a sharp step toward Eleanor, her voice losing its cultured polish and screeching into something raw and ugly. "You lying trash," she spat, the words echoing in the chapel's high ceilings. This is a setup, a pathetic, transparent attempt to sabotage this wedding because you couldn't keep him. Look at you. You think anyone would believe a man like Marcus would have children with someone like you? Her eyes swept over Eleanor's simple dress with pure contempt. The perfect facade of the gracious society bride was gone, stripped away to reveal the mercenary core beneath. She turned back to Marcus, her fingers digging into the silk of his sleeve, a pathetic, grasping claw. "Marcus, darling, tell them. Tell them this woman is insane. Have security remove her and these children immediately." Her voice was a frantic plea, but her eyes were demanding. This was a crisis to be managed, a public relations nightmare to be quashed. She was still trying to play the CEO's wife, to command the situation back into the neat, profitable box it was supposed to be in. But Marcus wasn't looking at her. He was still staring at the triplets, his expression one of dawning, horrific recognition. He was miles away, lost in a past Charlotte had never been part of and never cared to know. Her financial security, her social standing, her entire future was dissolving because of a secret he'd kept from her. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just an embarrassment. It was financial ruin. The merger was off. The shares, the assets, the allowance. All of it was contingent on this marriage. Her desperation peaked. "Do something," she shrieked, her voice cracking. She shook his arm, trying to break his trance. "This is our wedding day, our future. Are you going to let this spectacle destroy everything we've built?" But her words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. She was begging a man who was no longer there, whose attention was wholly consumed by the family he never knew he had. Her grasp on his arm tightened, a final, futile attempt to claim what she believed was hers. The pathetic nature of the gesture was not lost on anyone watching. She was no longer the victorious bride at the altar. She was just another obstacle in the path of a much larger, much more important truth. Is Charlotte's panic justified, or is she getting what she deserves? Let us know, justified or karma, in the comments. The evidence is coming next, so subscribe to see the proof that changes everything." Charlotte's desperate shriek seemed to break the spell that had held Marcus. He blinked, the present rushing back in a wave of heat and sound. But before he could form a response, before security could make a move, Eleanor acted. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't engage with Charlotte's hysteria. With a calm that was more terrifying than any outburst, she reached into the large leather bag hanging from the stroller's handle. The room held its breath, every eye fixed on her hands. She withdrew a simple manila folder, its edges worn from time and handling. It looked profoundly out of place amidst the satin and silk of the wedding party. "There are no theatrics, Charlotte," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the other woman's panic with quiet authority. She opened the folder. "Only documents. The truth is rarely dramatic. It's just true." She held up the first sheet, a lab report with an official-looking logo. Paternity test. 3 of them, in fact. 1 for each child. Conducted 6 months ago at Genetrix Diagnostics. All 3 show a 99.99% probability that Marcus Sterling is their biological father. She didn't wave the paper dramatically. She simply held it steady, allowing the stark black and white type to speak for itself. A few guests in the front pews, those with the sharpest eyesight, leaned forward, their whispers confirming what they were reading. Next came the hospital records. She displayed a photocopy of a birth certificate, dated just over 4 years ago. The names of the children, Alexander, Beatrice, and Charles, were listed. The space for father was blank, a silent accusation in itself. Then came another document, the official record of the birth from St. Jude's Hospital, detailing the birth of triplets to Eleanor Vance. The date aligned perfectly with the timeline of their relationship. Finally, she held up a faded, slightly creased ultrasound photo. It showed 3 distinct, ghostly shapes curled together. "This was taken the week before you fired me, Marcus," she said, her gaze finally returning to him. Her voice softened, not with sentiment, but with the weight of memory. "I was going to tell you that night. I had the photo in my pocket, but you made your choice before I had the chance." The final, most damning piece of evidence wasn't a document. It was the children themselves. As Eleanor spoke, the little girl, Beatrice, tired of the stroller, wriggled free and stood clinging to her mother's leg. She peered out at the crowd, her lower lip trembling. The light from the stained glass window caught her face, illuminating the sterling eyes, that unmistakable crystalline blue, but also the exact same cleft in her chin that Marcus had inherited from his own father. It was a familial trait so distinct that gasps erupted anew. Across the room, Marcus's mother, who had been sitting in stone-faced silence in the front row, suddenly went pale. Her hand flew to her pearls. She saw it too. The physical resemblance was no longer just a suspicion. It was a genetic certainty written on the face of a frightened little girl. The DNA tests were conclusive, but the living, breathing mirror image was the evidence that bypassed logic and went straight to the gut. The denial Marcus had been clinging to became an impossibility. The foundation of lies he'd built his life upon crumbled into dust. With the proof right there, what would your next move be? Comment documents if you think the paperwork is the clincher, or resemblance if the little girl's face is the real evidence. Subscribe because the family's dark secrets are revealed next. The gasp from the front row wasn't one of shock, but of pure, unadulterated panic. All eyes, including Marcus's, swiveled from the little girl's face to his mother, whose carefully composed mask had finally shattered. The color had drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking ancient and terrified. Her hand, still clutching her pearls, was visibly trembling. That single, unguarded reaction was more telling than any document Eleanor could have produced. It was a confession. Marcus stared at his mother, the pieces of a 5-year-old puzzle finally clicking into a horrifying picture. "Mother!" The word was a hoarse whisper, a plea for denial that he already knew would not come. Eleanor's voice remained steady, but it gained a new, harder edge, one sharpened by years of bitterness. She knew Marcus. They all knew. Her gesture took in the front row, where the senior board members and family lawyers sat stiffly, their faces a mixture of discomfort and grim acceptance. The week after you fired me, your mother paid me a visit. She offered me a substantial amount of money to disappear, to terminate the pregnancy. When I refused, the pressure started. The story unfolded not as a dramatic revelation, but as a cold, clinical recounting of a calculated operation. The headhunters I contacted were suddenly no longer interested. My rental application for a new apartment was mysteriously denied. A reliable source told my new employer about my unreliable character and the theft of recipes from Sterling Holdings. I was let go within a month. Eleanor's gaze never left Marcus's mother. It was a very effective campaign. The message was clear. I could take the money and vanish, or your family would ensure I had no life to build here. They told me you wanted nothing to do with me or the child. They said you were relieved to be free of the entanglement. She took a breath, the first sign of the immense effort this recitation was costing her. They lied to us both. They exiled me to protect the Sterling brand from a scandalous, inconvenient pregnancy. And they lied to you to protect the heir from a distraction that didn't fit the corporate strategy. I was a problem they managed. And you. She finally looked back at Marcus, her expression unreadable. You were an asset they steered, straight into a marriage that was just another line on a balance sheet. This wedding today isn't a betrayal of me, Marcus. It's the final product of the lie they built for you. The full scope of the deception crashed over him. His coldness after the firing, which he'd attributed to his own strength, had been carefully cultivated by their whispers. Their encouragement of his relationship with Charlotte, which he'd seen as familial approval, was just a strategic pivot. The portrait of his grandfather, the symbol of the dynasty, seemed to glare down from the imaginary study, its judgment no longer inspiring, but suffocating. He had been a puppet, and the strings had been pulled by the very people he trusted to guide him. The carefully constructed reputation of the Sterling family, built over generations, wasn't just crumbling. It was revealed to have been a hollow facade all along, a beautiful monument to greed and control. Who was more to blame? The family who plotted this, or Marcus who went along with it? Comment, family, or Marcus below. The children are about to speak their truth, so subscribe to hear what they have to say. The weight of Eleanor's words, the revelation of his family's orchestrated betrayal, left a profound silence in its wake. It was a silence so heavy it seemed to press down on the children, who had been watching the adult drama with wide, confused eyes. The confrontation had been a storm of raised voices and sharp words, a terrifying spectacle they couldn't possibly understand. Alexander, the boldest, broke first. He tugged on his mother's dress, his small voice slicing through the tension. "Mama, why is everyone so angry? Is that man mad at us?" He pointed a tiny, accusing finger at Marcus, his expression a perfect blend of confusion and defensive bravery. Eleanor knelt, her posture softening for the first time since her entrance. "No, sweetheart, no one is angry at you. The adults are just talking about some very old, very complicated things." But the damage was done. The question had been asked, and it hung there, highlighting the absurdity of the entire situation. A corporate and familial war being waged in front of 3 innocent bystanders. Beatrice, still clinging to her mother's leg, buried her face in the fabric of the simple dress. Her quiet whimpers were the only sound in the chapel. It was a raw, vulnerable noise that made the gasps and whispers of the guests seem cheap and voyeuristic. She wasn't crying for attention. She was crying because her world had suddenly become loud and scary. Charles, the shy one, remained in the stroller, but he had pulled his knees to his chest, making himself small, his own stuffed rabbit held like a shield against the chaos. Then, in a moment of heartbreaking instinct, Alexander took a hesitant step away from his mother and toward the man at the altar. He didn't run. He crept, a small explorer approaching a dangerous, unknown animal. He stopped a few feet from Marcus, tilting his head. The anger, the denial, the corporate shock, all of it bled from Marcus's face as he looked down at this small boy who was so unmistakably a part of him. The boy's courage was a stark contrast to his own historic cowardice. "The pictures Mama has," Alexander said, his voice smaller now, more uncertain. "You look sad in them. Are you sad?" It was an observation of stunning perceptiveness, seeing the isolation Marcus had always hidden behind his wealth and power. Before Marcus could form an answer, before his shattered mind could even process the question, Alexander took one more step. He didn't reach out. He simply stood there, a silent question in his eyes. And then the word, not shouted, not questioned, but stated with a simple, devastating certainty that came from a place beyond logic or proof. "Daddy." The word landed not as an accusation, but as a fact. It bypassed the DNA test, the hospital records, the corporate conspiracy. It went straight to the primal core of the moment. It was the truth, spoken by the only person in the entire chapel who had nothing to gain from lying. The visceral impact on Marcus was absolute. His breath hitched. The last of his defenses, the walls built by his family and fortified by his own choices, crumbled into dust. He wasn't a CEO at an altar. He was just a man, being called to account by the son he never knew. That one word changes everything. What would you feel hearing it for the first time? Let us know in the comments. The unraveling is just beginning, so hit subscribe for the emotional collapse. The word, Daddy, echoed in the vast, silent space of the chapel, and it found its target. It wasn't an accusation from an adult seeking revenge or restitution. It was a simple, biological truth spoken by a child who only knew what his mother's pictures had shown him, a man who looked sad. That simple observation, that innocent label, did what paternity tests and corporate conspiracies could not. It bypassed Marcus Sterling's intellect and went straight to his core. A physical tremor started deep within him, a vibration that began in his chest and traveled outward until his hands shook uncontrollably. He had to grip the edge of the wooden altar to steady himself, his knuckles bleaching white against the dark, polished wood. The cold, controlled exterior he had cultivated for a lifetime. The CEO persona that could fire an employee or greenlight a merger without a flicker of emotion, finally cracked. It didn't just crack, it shattered, falling away to reveal the raw, terrified man beneath. His gaze, which had been fixed on Alexander with a mixture of shock and denial, shifted. It swept over the three children, the bold son standing before him, the daughter hiding in her mother's dress, the shy boy in the stroller. He wasn't seeing problems or complications or public relations disasters anymore. He was seeing his children. His son had called him Daddy, and the weight of that title, of 5 years of absence, of birthday parties and scraped knees and bedtime stories he had missed, crashed down on him with the force of physical blow. He looked at Eleanor, truly looked at her for the first time since she'd entered. He saw not the angry ex-employee or the vengeful scorned woman, but the mother of his children. He saw the resilience in the set of her shoulders, the quiet strength it had taken to raise them alone, the profound weariness in her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant struggle. The lies his family had fed him, that she was a gold digger, that she had abandoned him, that she was an unstable element, dissolved into the meaningless ash they had always been. His entire worldview, a carefully constructed reality built on spreadsheets, social status, and familial expectation, collapsed into rubble. The merger, the wedding, the approval of the board members staring in horror, none of it mattered. The only things that were real, the only things that had ever been truly real, were standing right in front of him in this aisle. A tear, hot and entirely unfamiliar, welled in his eye and traced a path down his cheek. It was the first tear he had shed since he was a boy, and it felt like the breaking of a dam he hadn't known he'd built. He wasn't the billionaire at the altar anymore. He was just a man, utterly unraveled, standing in the wreckage of the life he had chosen, finally seeing the life he had lost. What do you think is going through Marcus's mind right now? Comment with one word that describes his emotion. The fallout is about to go public, so subscribe to see the humiliation unfold. The single tear on Marcus's cheek was a signal flare, and the vultures descended. The stunned silence broke into a cacophony of whispered exclamations and the frantic, unmistakable click of smartphone cameras. Every guest had become a journalist, every device a broadcast station. Society reporters who had come to cover a wedding of the year were now frantically thumbing new headlines into their phones, their faces alight with the kind of career-making scandal they could only dream of. Sterling Heir's secret family storms altar. Billionaire's wedding crashed by triplets. The news wasn't just leaking, it was flooding the digital world in real time. Marcus could feel the collective gaze of his board members burning into his back from the front pew. Their horrified looks weren't about moral outrage. They were calculating the immediate stock market implications. Sterling Holdings stock, already volatile ahead of the merger, would crater the second the market opened. The carefully managed public image he had spent a lifetime building, the cool, untouchable, brilliant Heir, was evaporating before his eyes, replaced by the image of a crumbling man publicly confronted by his own abandoned children. The whispers were no longer hushed. He caught fragments. Always knew he was cold. The poor woman, those poor children, what a monster. He wasn't a titan of industry in this moment. He was a spectacle, a pariah. The complete and utter evaporation of his control was the most humiliating sensation of his life. He was exposed, and the entire world was watching. Charlotte watched Marcus's single tear trace a path through the perfectly applied makeup on his cheek, and something inside her finally snapped. The shock and panic that had gripped her curdled into pure, white-hot rage. She wasn't just losing a husband. She was losing her ticket to the life she had sacrificed everything to attain. The humiliation was a secondary but potent agony. She, Charlotte Winthrop, was being publicly discarded for a common chef and her illegitimate brood. The fragile control she'd been clinging to evaporated completely. Her hand, which had been gripping his arm in a pathetic plea, tightened into a claw, her nails digging deep into the expensive fabric of his tuxedo sleeve. "How dare you?" she shrieked, her voice no longer a whisper but a raw, piercing sound that echoed off the stone walls. She rounded on him, her face a mask of fury, all pretense of graciousness gone. "You pathetic liar. You dragged me into this circus. You let me stand here, believing I was marrying a man of substance, when you're nothing but a fraud with a trail of bastard children." She then turned her venom on Eleanor, her eyes blazing with hatred. "And you think you've won? You think this display of poverty and desperation makes you noble? You're just the trash he used and threw away. You'll always be trash." Her words were meant to wound, to reduce Eleanor back to the status Charlotte believed she deserved. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply stood, a rock in the face of the storm, her hand resting protectively on Alexander's head, her silence a more powerful rebuke than any retort. It was this calm dignity that pushed Charlotte over the edge. She took a stumbling step forward, her arm raised as if to strike, a final, desperate lunge to reclaim some semblance of power. But she never made contact. Two security guards, who had been hovering uncertainly at the edge of the chaos, finally moved. They weren't approaching Eleanor, as Marcus had initially commanded. They moved toward Charlotte, their expressions grimly professional. Each took one of her arms in a firm but respectful grip. "Let go of me," she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria as she struggled against them. "Do you know who I am? I am a bride. This is my wedding. Get your hands off me." But her protests were meaningless. She was no longer the center of this drama. She was a sideshow, an obstacle to be removed. As they began to lead her, stumbling, back down the aisle she had so triumphantly walked up, she craned her neck, her final words a screamed promise laced with venom. "You'll regret this, Marcus. I'll ruin you. And you," she spat toward Eleanor, "you haven't won anything. You've just inherited a broken man." The walk back was a grotesque parody of a bridal procession. The guests watched in stunned silence, some with pity, most with morbid fascination. Just before she was escorted through the main doors, she stopped struggling for a moment. With a gesture of pure, theatrical defiance, she ripped the massive, borrowed diamond ring from her finger. She didn't drop it, she flung it. It skittered across the marble floor, a glittering symbol of a transaction that had failed, coming to a rest near the base of the altar. Then she was gone, her screamed threats echoing for a moment before the heavy oak doors swung shut, leaving a silence that was somehow louder than her rage. She had been the stand-in bride, and her fall was as spectacular as it was complete. Was Charlotte's downfall deserved, or was she a victim too? Type deserved or victim in the comments. The matriarch is about to face her reckoning, so subscribe now. The heavy thud of the chapel doors closing behind Charlotte's screaming exit left a different kind of silence in its wake. It was a vacuum, and all eyes instinctively turned to the epicenter of the original sin, Marcus's mother, Elizabeth Sterling. Throughout the entire confrontation, she had remained a statue in the front pew, her back ramrod straight, her face an immovable mask of aristocratic disdain. But the mask was a lie. The panic that had flashed across her features when she saw Beatrice's chin had been real, and now, with Charlotte gone and the full truth exposed, the weight of her complicity was a physical pressure crushing her. She refused to look at Marcus, at Eleanor, at the children. Her gaze was fixed on some distant point above the altar, as if praying for divine intervention that would not come. Slowly, deliberately, she rose from the pew. The movement was stiff, lacking its usual grace. It was the movement of a prisoner leaving the dock after a guilty verdict. She did not glance at the guests whose whispers had turned to a low, judgmental hum. She did not acknowledge the board members shifting uncomfortably beside her. She simply turned, her chin held high in a final, pathetic display of pride, and began to walk toward the side exit, a small, discreet door meant for the clergy. It was a coward's exit, an attempt to slip away from the consequences of her own actions. She had almost reached the door, her hand outstretched for the brass handle, when Eleanor's voice cut through the quiet. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was calm, clear, and it stopped Elizabeth Sterling in her tracks. "He has your eyes, Elizabeth." That was all. No accusation, no recrimination. Just a simple, devastating statement of fact. Eleanor was looking at Alexander, who was still standing near Marcus, his small face a perfect blend of curiosity and apprehension. The words hung in the air, and Elizabeth's shoulders, which had been held so rigidly, sagged almost imperceptibly. She did not turn around. She did not reply. But in that slight slump of her posture was an unspoken acknowledgement of her role. She had orchestrated the destruction of a family to protect her idea of a dynasty, and in doing so, she had deprived herself of her own grandchildren for 5 years. The weight of that maternal failure was a heavier sentence than any public humiliation. Her hand dropped from the door handle. She stood there for a long moment, trapped between the world she was trying to escape and the family she had shattered, before finally pushing the door open and disappearing into the shadows of the vestry, utterly alone. The silence she left behind was her true confession. Was Elizabeth's silent exit a sign of guilt or just more pride? Comment guilt or pride below. Marcus is about to make his choice, so subscribe to see what he does next. The chapel doors clicked shut, sealing Elizabeth Sterling's exit and leaving a profound quiet in her wake. The spectacle was over. The audience of shocked guests, the furious bride, the complicit family, all had receded, leaving only the core of the shattered reality. Marcus stood alone at the altar, but he was no longer looking at the empty space where Charlotte had been or the door his mother had fled through. His entire being was focused on the small family unit in the aisle. Eleanor, a pillar of weary resilience, and his children, Alexander, who had called him daddy, Beatrice, who hid her face, Charles, who watched from the safety of the stroller. The weight of the moment was absolute, a physical pressure on his chest. Every instinct he had cultivated to control, to manage, to strategize was useless here. This wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a life to be faced. He took a slow, deliberate step down from the altar, the sound of his polished shoe on the marble step echoing in the silence. Then another. He wasn't walking toward Eleanor with a plan or an apology crafted for her benefit. He was drawn toward the children, pulled by a force deeper than reason. He stopped a few feet from Alexander, who watched him with a child's unblinking curiosity, no longer afraid, just waiting. Marcus's expensive tuxedo, his Rolex watch, his billionaire status, none of it mattered. He was stripped bare. He slowly lowered himself, not to one knee in some romantic gesture, but to both, sinking to the floor so that his eyes were level with his son's. The movement was awkward, unpracticed, the posture of a man completely out of his element. He didn't look at Eleanor. His apology was not for her, not yet. It was for the three small people who had paid the price for his cowardice. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he hadn't used in years. It wasn't the cold, corporate tone from minutes before. It was raw, broken, and utterly sincere. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 5 years of absence, of first steps, first words, scraped knees, and nightmares he had missed. He looked from Alexander to Beatrice, who peeked out from behind her mother's dress, her blue eyes, his eyes, wide and uncertain. "I'm sorry I didn't know about you. That is my fault. A very, very big fault." His gaze then shifted to Charles and the stroller, who clutched his rabbit tighter. Marcus offered a small, tentative smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes but was free of calculation. "And I'm sorry I didn't know about you two." He made a vow then, not to Eleanor, but to them. "From this moment forward," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength, a new kind of resolve that had nothing to do with boardrooms and everything to do with a child's trust. "I will be here. I will be your father. I will be present." It was a promise spoken not from a position of power, but from one of profound humility. Then came the most difficult part. He slowly raised his hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and held it palm up in the space between him and Alexander. It wasn't a demand. It was a question, a request for permission. He was asking, for the first time in his life, to be allowed into something. He didn't speak. He just waited, his breath caught in his throat, his entire future hinging on the hesitant acceptance of a 4-year-old boy. Alexander looked at the offered hand, then up at his mother's face. Eleanor gave a barely perceptible nod, her own expression a complex mix of caution, hope, and exhaustion. The boy turned back to Marcus. For a long moment, he just stared. Then, with a courage that far exceeded his years, he placed his small hand into his father's. The contact was electric. It was warm, trusting, and it sealed the choice Marcus had made. There was no going back to the gilded cage. He had chosen the messy, complicated, terrifying truth of fatherhood. What would you have done in Marcus's position? Comment same or different below. The walk away is an iconic moment. Subscribe to witness it. The warmth of his son's small hand in his was an anchor in the storm, a point of pure, uncomplicated truth. Marcus slowly rose, his eyes meeting Eleanor's over the children's heads. The silence between them was no longer charged with the electricity of confrontation, but with the heavy, uncertain static of a future yet to be written. He saw the wariness in her gaze, the deep-seated fear that this was just another performance, another sterling manipulation. He knew words were worthless now. They were the currency he had debased. He glanced down the long, opulent aisle he had just walked with Charlotte. It was a tunnel of judgment now, lined with the stunned, silent faces of a life he was leaving behind. Every step would be a repudiation of that life. He took a slow, deep breath, then offered his arm to Eleanor. It wasn't a command or an expectation. It was a question, a silent request for the first fragile step toward amends. It was the only thing he had left to offer, a choice. Eleanor looked from his face to the children. Alexander's hand was still trustingly in Marcus's. Beatrice had emerged fully from behind her dress, and Charles was watching with wide, curious eyes. Her children had already, in their innocent way, accepted this terrifying new reality. Her own choices had led them here, to this moment of impossible public reckoning. To refuse this gesture would be to deny the entire purpose of her coming. After a hesitation that felt like an eternity, she gave a single, curt nod. She didn't take his arm. Instead, she placed her hand firmly on the stroller's handle. "We walk together," she said, her voice low but clear. "Not as anything else. as parents. It was a boundary, a necessary one. Marcus nodded, understanding the distinction completely. He was not being offered forgiveness or reconciliation. He was being granted a chance to accompany them, nothing more. He turned, and with Alexander's hand clasped firmly in his, he began to walk. Eleanor pushed the stroller beside him, a united front of the most fractured kind. The triplets followed their mother like ducklings, their small procession a stark contrast to the solitary, powerful figure he had been just an hour before. The walk back down the aisle was the longest of his life. The guests didn't speak. They didn't move. They simply watched, a gallery of silent witnesses to the complete dismantling of a dynasty. The only sounds were the soft squeak of the stroller's wheels on the marble and the quiet, shuffling steps of the children. He didn't look left or right. His focus was on the heavy oak doors at the end, on the sliver of ordinary daylight visible through them. With every step, he felt the weight of the gilded cage, the expectations, the lies, the cold ambition, fall away from his shoulders, leaving him lighter and more terrified than he had ever been. They reached the doors and pushed through, stepping out of the curated perfection of the chapel and into the messy, uncertain reality of the world, leaving nothing but a stunned silence and the echo of a life irrevocably changed. That walk is one of the most powerful moments. What would you have been thinking? Comment your one-word thought below. The aftermath is next, so subscribe for the fallout. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind the fractured family, sealing the chapel in a vacuum of silence. For a long moment, nobody moved. The guests remained frozen in their pews. The string quartet held their instruments like forgotten relics, and the wedding planner stood by the pulpit, her clipboard dangling from limp fingers. The air, once thick with perfume and anticipation, now hung heavy with the scent of scandal and the echo of a life imploding. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the silence shattered into a chaotic buzz. 100 phones were raised simultaneously, not to capture a celebration, but to report a catastrophe. The low murmur grew into an excited roar as guests scrambled for the exits, already dialing, texting, posting, each one a node in the network that would broadcast the sterling humiliation to the world before Marcus's car had even left the curb. Across the room, the senior board members huddled in a tight, panicked knot, their faces ashen. The Sterling Holdings merger with Charlotte's family was not just off. It was a radioactive liability. Phones buzzed incessantly in their pockets, calls from investors, analysts, the stock exchange. One of them, a man named Reynolds, pulled out his device, his hand trembling as he saw the first alert flash across the screen. Sterling stock was already plummeting in after-hours trading. He looked toward the altar, not at the man who had been there, but at the space he had vacated, and muttered to his colleague, "The vultures are circling. We need to issue a statement." Now, the corporate machinery was already shifting into damage control mode, desperately trying to contain a blast radius that was expanding by the second. The cleaning staff, who had been waiting discreetly in the wings to transform the chapel for the reception, now emerged cautiously. They moved through the emptying space like ghosts, their whispers lost in the din. They gathered around the abandoned stroller Eleanor had left behind, picking up a dropped pacifier and a small, worn stuffed rabbit. One of the older women shook her head, her eyes full of a weary wisdom. "Money can't buy you out of mess like this," she said softly to her companion, pocketing the toy to keep it safe. "That's a hurt that goes deeper than any bank account." They began the somber task of cleaning up the detritus of the failed ceremony. The discarded programs, a forgotten shawl, the glittering diamond ring Charlotte had flung away, which now lay like a worthless pebble near the altar. The grand chapel, designed for moments of perfect union, was left holding only the cold, empty echo of a devastating revelation. The fallout is immediate and brutal. Who do you think is hit hardest by the aftermath? Comment Marcus, corporate, or family. The new reality begins now, so subscribe for the car ride that changes everything. The car ride was thick with unspoken words. The triplets' innocent questions filled the quiet space. Eleanor and Marcus's first real conversation in years began with painful, awkward honesty. The first fragile moments of co-parenting had begun. The stark silence of Marcus's penthouse was a universe away from the chaotic grandeur of the chapel. He hadn't brought them to one of his corporate apartments or a sterile hotel suite. He'd brought them home, to the place that had always felt more like a museum exhibit than a residence. The children's hesitant footsteps on the polished marble floors echoed in the vast, minimalist space, their wide eyes taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased a glittering cityscape that now felt like a backdrop to a different life. Eleanor stood by the doorway, her arms crossed, a silent sentinel of caution. The drive over had been a study in awkwardness, filled only with the children's questions and Marcus's stilted, overly formal attempts to answer. He didn't wait. The need to act, to prove the vow he'd made on the chapel floor, was more than just words, was a physical urgency. While Eleanor settled the exhausted children in the living room, their small forms dwarfed by a massive white sofa, Marcus retreated to his study. He closed the door and picked up the phone. The calls he made were not to publicists or lawyers specializing in damage control. The first was to his most discreet real estate agent. "I need a house," he said, his voice stripped of its usual corporate inflection. 4 bedrooms at least. A yard. A good school district. Somewhere quiet. Find it. Today. The agent, used to requests for penthouses and investment properties, was momentarily speechless before stammering an acknowledgement. The next call was to his personal attorney. "Draw up the papers to formally acknowledge paternity for Alexander, Beatrice, and Charles Sterling," he instructed, the names feeling both foreign and profoundly right on his tongue. "I want it irrevocable, and establish trust funds for each of them. Substantial. Education, health, their future. Make it untouchable by anyone but them when they come of age." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a cautious question about prenuptial agreements and the collapsed merger. Marcus cut him off. "That's no longer my priority. The children are. Make it happen." He hung up before the lawyer could protest further. He emerged from the study to find Eleanor standing by the window, watching the city lights. The children had finally succumbed to exhaustion, curled together on the vast sofa like a pile of puppies. He didn't offer her empty promises or plead for forgiveness. He simply handed her a set of keys to a nearby, fully furnished apartment he owned. "It's yours for as long as you need," he said, his voice low. "There's food in the kitchen. You're all safe there. I'll stay here." It was a gesture of space, of respect for the boundaries she had set. His vow, he understood, was to earn back trust through action, not words. He had to prove he could provide stability without demanding anything in return. Eleanor took the keys, her fingers brushing against his. She studied his face, searching for the cold calculation she had known for so long. She saw only a raw, unfamiliar exhaustion and a determination that seemed to have nothing to do with winning. It was the look of a man starting a long, difficult climb with no guarantee of success. She gave a slow, cautious nod. It wasn't acceptance, but it was acknowledgement of the first step. This new, terrifying path of co-parenting had begun not with reconciliation, but with a series of practical, irrevocable commitments. Are Marcus's actions genuine change, or just damage control? Comment change or control below. The story's final emotional beat is next, so subscribe for the profound purpose. Later that night, after Eleanor had taken the sleeping children to the temporary apartment, Marcus stood alone in the deafening silence of his penthouse. The events of the day played like a surreal film in his mind. The cold altar, Eleanor's determined entrance, the children's faces, the word daddy, hanging in the air. The grand space, which had always been a symbol of his success, now felt like a hollow, empty shell. He paced the length of the living room, his footsteps echoing, each one a reminder of his isolation. He couldn't stay here. The thought was sudden and absolute. This wasn't a home. It was a monument to the man he had been, a man he no longer recognized or wanted to be. Driven by an impulse he didn't fully understand, he left. He didn't call his driver. He walked the several blocks to the apartment building, the cool night air a shock to his system. He didn't go up. He stood across the street, looking up at the lit window of the apartment he had given them. He saw Eleanor's silhouette pass by the curtain, then disappear. He saw nothing else, but the simple knowledge that they were there, safe and together, grounded him in a way no business triumph ever had. He wasn't guarding them. He was anchoring himself to the only real thing left in his life. The next evening, he arrived at the new, much smaller house the agent had secured. It was a far cry from the penthouse, a two-story home with a sliver of a garden in the back, located on a quiet, tree-lined street. It felt human. He found Eleanor in the kitchen, unpacking a box of groceries. The children were exploring their new rooms, their excited shouts echoing through the empty spaces. "Can I help?" he asked, the question awkward. She simply pointed to a box labeled books. That night, after a tense, quiet dinner of takeout pizza eaten on the floor, Beatrice, overwhelmed by the strange day, began to cry. It was a tired, confused cry. Marcus watched as Eleanor effortlessly soothed her, but the little girl's tears seemed to pull at something deep inside him. He walked over to the small stack of books he'd unpacked and picked one at random, a classic children's story about a bear. He didn't ask permission. He just sat on the floor, his back against a bare wall, and began to read. His voice was stiff at first, unfamiliar with the rhythms of a bedtime story. But as he read, something shifted. Alexander crept over and sat beside him, leaning against his arm. Then Charles, clutching his rabbit, settled on his other side. Even Beatrice, her tears drying, crawled in her mother's lap but kept her eyes fixed on him. He wasn't a CEO reading a quarterly report. He was just a man, using his voice to comfort his children. The unfamiliar feeling that washed over him wasn't triumph or satisfaction. It was a profound, quiet sense of purpose. This was what mattered. This simple, unglamorous act of being present was the most important work he would ever do. Eleanor watched from the doorway, her own heart a tangled knot of conflicting emotions. She saw the billionaire brought to his knees not by a corporate raid, but by the weight of a storybook. She saw the careful, awkward way he turned the pages, the way his voice softened when Alexander asked a question. It wasn't a performance. It was the first fragile evidence of a man trying to become something new. The road ahead would be long and painful, filled with awkward conversations and the ghosts of past betrayals. But in that moment, watching her children find a sliver of comfort in the voice of the man who had caused so much pain, she allowed herself a cautious flicker of hope. This wasn't an ending. It was a fraught, complicated, and utterly necessary beginning. That final image is so powerful. What's the one thing you'll remember from this story? Let us know in the comments. This concludes our tale, but subscribe for more dramatic stories of redemption and truth. An hour later, Marcus sat in the quiet gloom of the children's new bedroom, a sleeping Alexander curled trustingly against his chest. The weight of the small, warm body was a tangible anchor, a burden he welcomed. The gilded cage of his old life, he realized with devastating clarity, had never had a lock. The door had always been open. He had simply been too obsessed with polishing the bars to notice. The subscribe button is your key to more stories, where secrets unravel and lies are rebuilt from the truth. The unfamiliar weight in Marcus's arms was the most real thing he had ever held. Alexander's slow, steady breath warmed his neck, a tiny metronome counting out the seconds of this new, terrifying reality. The faint scent of baby shampoo and clean pajamas had replaced the usual sterile air of his penthouse. He didn't dare move, afraid to break the fragile spell of trust that had allowed his son to fall asleep against him. From the doorway, Eleanor watched, her silhouette framed in the soft light from the hall. Her arms were crossed, not in defiance, but as if holding herself together. The conflict in her eyes was a silent storm, residual anger, profound exhaustion, and a reluctant, dawning recognition that the man reading a bedtime story to their children was not the same man who had coldly denied them hours before. He had read the story about the bear with a voice rough from disuse in anything but boardroom negotiations, stumbling over the whimsical phrases. But the children hadn't cared about his performance. They had cared about his presence. Alexander's small body relaxing against him. Beatrice's quiet sigh as she finally succumbed to sleep in her new bed. Charles already lost to dreams with his rabbit clutched tight. These were victories no stock surge had ever offered. This was a different currency, one of quiet moments and earned trust, and he was starting from a deficit so massive it felt insurmountable. The profound sense of purpose that settled over him was not a triumphant feeling. It was a weight, heavy and sobering. It was the understanding that his life's work was no longer a company, but the three small humans sleeping in this room. The road of redemption stretched out before him, long and steep, and every step would require a humility he had never practiced. Eleanor's gaze held all of this, a silent acknowledgement of the journey ahead and the countless hurdles they would have to clear, together and apart. The door to his gilded cage had never been locked. He had simply never tried the handle. The weight of his sleeping son in his arms was the only truth that mattered now. For more stories where hidden lives collide and redemption is earned, not bought, subscribe and turn on notifications for our next dramatic revelation. That final image says it all. What was the most powerful moment for you? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe for more stories where truth rewrites destiny.